So it's been a moment since I've actually went ahead and recorded a video. I got kind of frustrated with this video I'm actually going to be posting today. So we'll be diving into the rest of the starter decks that was going to go over in my, 3 series video thing. If you want to see, I think they'll be posted somewhere in here as I kind of do the editing and whatnot. But we're going to be diving into the last 2 starter decks and kind of going over how I would go about upgrading them to kind of maybe make them a little bit more on the competitive side compared to maybe their original form, going over some cards I would add, some of the things I probably don't like in each one of them. There used to be actually 2 more starter decks that I think existed at one point, but they got banned because of a card out of them got banned, which was Lucky Clover, so I don't think they reward you with them anymore. At least I didn't have them in my library. But, they are starter decks that did exist at one point. But if you're new here and like the video, guys, hit that like button. It definitely helps out a lot. Lets me know that you guys like these style of videos. If you want to see more videos like this, hit the subscribe button so you'll be notified when I do post new videos on the channel. But with that being said, let's just dive into the decks and let's talk about it. So the first deck we're going to be talking about in today's video is the Massive Menagerie, which essentially is a deck that we're just trying to get curve out to get to our top, top cards in the deck overall. Most of the cards in the deck cost, a very large amount of mana for the most part. The bottom half is really the ramp cards that we want to use to get to that point. And it's actually a pretty interesting deck. I would say it struggles in the part that because it's blue-green, it kind of struggles with, well, sure, it has some spells that, will, do damage directly to other creatures. But that's essentially it. There's not really much in the way of, board wipes or anything like that, or single target damage that, needs a creature in order to do said damage. And the other thing, too, is if we don't get into our RAM package, the deck does perform a little bit slower compared to the more aggressive aggro-style decks. So that is some of the weaknesses that you do get with a deck that is kind of like this. But I do think when the deck does work, and you kind of are able to get your RAM package out and kind of ramp up and play, a card that's normally 7 mana on turn, 5 or 4, even, depending how lucky you are, with how you draw, the deck does perform fairly well. And the way it does it in multiple different ways. So essentially the way we're doing it here, the 1-drops really don't matter and they don't really help the ramp method here. But the 1-drop first one is Witch and Well. It's a 1-mana artifact that when it enters battlefield you scry 2. So it helps you set up like maybe later turns. I don't know if it really fits in the deck. Sure, scry is great, but you really have to pay the 4 mana to really get the benefit of strong 4 cards. And I think there's just better cards in the format overall. You can pay 1 more mana for Omen of the Sea if you really want something like this, where you scry 2 and draw a card at least of it, and then later in the game you can always pay the 3 mana and sacrifice it to scry 2. And you can now with the various new cards that we have that can just draw cards. I think what is it, Might of the Multiverse? You can foretell that and then scry 2 and draw 2, which is also very good. Sure, that costs 4 mana to set up and play, but it is, I think, an overall better card just for what it does. So, Witch and Well is okay, in the starter form, but I do think there's easy upgrades that are even commons and uncommons that you definitely go for immediately if you want to upgrade there. Then you got the Almighty Bushwhack. It's another interesting 1-drop here. It's a 1/1 for 1. It has Trample, which you would assume a 1/1 with Trample, or it's not going to really do too much just because it's not very threatening. But you can pay for it when you have a decent amount of mana out, and you can actually give a +3/+3, so you can pump it up, essentially, which then makes it a little bit more on the aggressive side. It is a little bit on the costly side, so it's not really going to get very big very quickly. But, it is a way to get an early game threat out on the board that could possibly do some big damage later in the game. Yet again, it's another card that you could keep in the deck if you really wanted to, but, this is definitely a card that's cuttable if you want to replace it with something else, or just, add in more things that are going to ramp up in the deck. Then you got Ram Through. It's a 2 mana, target creature control deals damage equal to its power to target creature you don't control. If the creature you control has Trample, it deals excess damage to that creature's power instead. So essentially, this is just a way to deal damage to target creature. If the creature has Trample, the excess damage is going to go. So, we have cards in our deck that is a 6/6 with Trample that you may see kind of by my head. And essentially, if you hit that on a 3/3 or something like that, the extra 3 damage is going to be your opponent's face. So definitely a very strong removal spell in a way. The only problem is if your opponent decides to bounce or remove your creature that you're going to target with this, that you're dealing the damage with, it kind of nullifies the thing, so it does 0 damage. That's the one downfall to a spell like this. That essentially would be the downfall to most fight spells. So if you have other fight spells you have an idea of playing, the one downfall is getting rid of the creature that you're targeting to deal a damage is going to be a problem that you're going to have to work around with. Then you got the Buffalo Haven. This is actually a pretty decent ramp card, just in the sense that whatever mana source you add this to, it's going to actually produce additional green source. So that's definitely pretty cool. You can put it on a blue land and it actually produce blue and green mana whenever you tap it, so definitely very good there. And in the later game, if you really don't need that excess mana, you can always have 5 mana and sacrifice it and create a 2/2 wolf token to maybe, put that extra pressure on. Because everything's kind of expensive in the deck, it's kind of hard to go very wide, essentially, very early. So this is always a good way to go a little bit wider, maybe on your opponent if your opponent doesn't play too many creatures. But like I said, pretty decent way to kind of ramp up for 2 mana. Then you get the Marleaf Pixie, a decent solid 2 mana 2/2. It does create blue, green mana. It has flying, so definitely very good there if you ever want to get aggressive and maybe attack in the air. But having another, 2 mana, ramp spell is definitely very good. It is, very susceptible to getting removed by, removal spells and things that do damage to it. But, if it does stay out on the battlefield for a few turns, you definitely can take it to your advantage and kind of ramp up pretty quickly. Then you got Cultivate, which is a card that I do enjoy. It's not rare. It's just the alternate art form that I do have, so it makes it seem like it's a rare form. But, I think this card's an uncommon, so it's a pretty inexpensive card, and you get 2 in the deck to already begin with. But, it's a pretty solid ramp spell for 3 mana because, 1, it gets you 2 lands from your library and puts 1 into your hand and 1 into the battlefield tapped, which is definitely very good. So even if you don't have maybe the 5th land, you actually can set yourself up to have that additional land, which is definitely good there. And, putting out your deck from basic land cards is definitely good in that sense as well. So definitely a good card. This is something you could always increase copies of in the deck if you want to, get that more, consistent ramp effect overall. Then you got Fully Grown. It's an interesting card in the deck just because our deck is fairly large and, it gives target creature +3/+3 and puts a trample counter on it. So, combine that with something like Ram Through, creates a very decent threat in a sense. And gives a creature trample that may not otherwise already have it. So definitely good there as well. It's an overall decent card. It's just very, ineffective way to spend 3 mana unless you're in the late game. You're just really just trying to trample over for that maybe last bit of damage. In the early game, it's not as effective just because 3 mana is a lot to commit, especially if you're trying to really ramp up and play your bigger things. But if you keep it in the deck, it's okay. Just give something trample that may not have it. So it's up, like I said, it's up to you. But, it's something I would probably cut from the deck just because to me, I think there's better pump effects that cost less mana, I think, overall, that you can do at instant speed. Surprisingly, I think red actually has better ones for, 1 or 2 mana, so there's that as well. But I do think you can probably find something better or more efficient to work out there. The Land of Visionary, it's a 3 mana 2/2. When it enters the battlefield, you get to draw a card, and then later, after it has some sickness wears off, you can actually tap it and add green mana. It's definitely a good card. Combine that with Marleaf Pixie, those are 2 decently solid creatures that you can actually ramp with. So I mean, both work. So depending on how you go with, you can always increase copies of this just because drawing a card's always beneficial. And it's definitely interesting that they took 2 different cards that actually exist in Magic currently, which is the Elvish Visionary and the Llanowar Elf, and they actually combined it into 1 card to kind of get both effects, which is definitely a pretty cool ability overall. Then move on to the 4-drop slot, which is our only 4-drop, which is a Thunder Snapper. It's a card that just benefits us from playing our more expensive things because whenever we play something with 5 or more power, or cost of 5 or greater, we get to draw a card. So definitely good in that sense. Overall, it's a pretty vanilla creature. If you play somehow Devotion in some sort of way, it's definitely a good Devotion creature. But other than that, it really only benefits us when we play those more expensive things. So it's definitely a card that's definitely good in the later game once we kind of are just pumping out big things. But for the most part, it's kind of a meh card, I would personally say. So, it's up to you if you want to keep it or remove it. Now going into the 5-drops and stuff like that, the more expensive cards in the deck, we're kind of going to get into the more effective ones and ones that you probably could cut out. Because, like I said, the goal of the deck is to kind of get to this part of the game where you're starting to play these big creatures, to overwhelm your opponent or maybe, remove your opponent's things from the board. So definitely this is one of those things where you can kind of switch it out as you get more rares and mythics. Just because there's more effective creatures that may have entered the battlefield effects and things like that. So definitely things we can definitely take advantage of. So the first card up is Elder Gargaroth. This is a card that came out from M21. It's a 6/6 for 5 mana, which already makes it a great card just in that sense. It has Vigilance, which means it doesn't tap to attack. It has Reach, so it can block things in the air, and also has Trample. So does excess damage to your opponent if your opponent tries to chump block it with something. And then whenever attacks are blocks, you get to choose one. Create a 3/3 green beast token, which is definitely very good. Helps you get a little bit wider on your opponent. Gain 3 life. If you get to this point, your opponent's maybe a little bit more on the aggressive side. Definitely a good way to get back that life. And draw a card, which is definitely a good way to fill up your hand because we're not playing too many things that really draw a bunch of cards. So it is a good way to kind of refill that hand back up. This is definitely a card I would increase copies of just because overall it's a solid card. If your opponent doesn't have any good solid way to remove it. This is something they don't want to attack into, just because if they do, you're going to start pumping out creatures, you're going to start gaining some life, which could nullify maybe the damage they're trying to do to you, which makes their attack not as good, to attack into you with that. Then to follow it up, we have Keeper of the Fables. It's a 5 mana 4/5. Whenever one or more non-human creatures you control deal damage to a player, draw a card. It's a decent card to kind of go with our Trampler creatures, because the excess damage is still going to be dealt to your opponent, and then therefore drawing you a card. It's decent to keep in the deck for the most part up until you start really, thinning out maybe some of these cards that kind of are very reliant on other things to kind of go off. It's still a 4/5 for 5 mana, which isn't too bad, but, it's no Elder Gargaroth in that power sense. Sure, it has an effect, but it's nowhere as powerful, and that's the thing where you kind of think about, because the deck wants to put power things on the battlefield, you really want some really effective, powerful cards on the battlefield when you start really upgrading the deck overall. You got Serpent of the Yawning Depths. I'm blocking its power and toughness, but it's a 6/6 for 6 mana, which is okay. 6 mana for a 6/6 is okay. And Krakens, Leviathans, Octopuses, and Serpents you control can't be blocked except by Krakens, Leviathans, Octopuses, and Serpents you control, are the Serpents your opponent may control. So that's the one thing. It's an okay card in that sense. It doesn't have trample. It doesn't have some crazy ability. It's just essentially it's a 6/6 unblockable for the most part, unless your opponent's playing this or playing one of those other things, which is highly unlikely because there's not too many of them in the format that people are really, really playing. So it's okay in that sense that most of the time it can get in for free damage because your opponent's not going to have something to put in its way. But, it's something that could be easily replaced, just because I don't think you want to increase copies of it. It's nice to have, but, it's eventually something you can easily replace as you start maybe getting some more effective other cards in slots. Then you get Sublime Epiphany. It's a 6 mana spell that has choose one or more, so you can actually choose multiples of these effects that I'm kind of blocking. But essentially you can choose one or more, which is counter target spells, so you can counter something and then choose the other abilities on top of it. You can counter target activated or triggered ability, which counts as things like ATB effects or enter the battlefield effects, or triggered abilities that, like, maybe, for example, if you're playing rogues and your opponent plays a rogue and they already have like the rogue that makes your opponent mill a card whenever you play a rogue, you can counter that. So there's something like that. You can return a non-land permanent to its owner's hand, which is definitely very good. You can bounce a card back to your opponent's hand that's not a land. So overall, pretty good in that sense. You can create a token that's a copy of target creature you control, which is always good because there's cards that take benefit of us, playing creatures into the battlefield. You can maybe, if your opponent's eliminated one, you can always counter that and then always make a copy of the creature they may be targeting with this. And then you draw a card, which is also very good. So it's definitely very good. It can get very confusing if you're doing multiples of these, just because a lot of arrows start popping up in different colors. But the way to easily kind of figure it out, depending on how you're using the spell, it's always going to start at the top and work its way down the spell. So depending on how many things you're choosing, it's going to do each one of them in the order of how it is on the card. So just to pay in mind. And I think there may be a UI tooltip, but sometimes I feel like it bugs out and I don't see it because I've played this card a few times, not maybe in this deck, but in other versions. And sometimes it's not as obvious to what the arrows are doing, but then I kind of figured out that it's actually in the order of how you choose the effects. Next card up is Kogla. It's another one of our big creatures. It's 7/6 card for 6 mana, which is definitely very good. It is a little bit on the heavy green side because it's 3 green to play it, so we needed at least 3 green mana on the battlefield in order to play it. But there's a lot of things that ramp into green or produce green mana in our deck, so that's very good. But when it enters the battlefield, it fights up to 1 target creature you don't control, so essentially it comes in the battlefield, fights a creature, so that's good. And then whenever it attacks, destroy target artifact or enchantment defendant player controls. So essentially, if your opponent's playing any equipments or any artifacts that maybe, removing one of your creatures from the battlefield, you can always destroy it whenever it attacks, which is always effective. It definitely puts pressure on your opponent that way. And then 2 mana, if we had you can return a human creature you control to its owner's hand, and Kogla gains indestructible end of turn. We don't really play too many humans in the deck, but if you do decide to upgrade and maybe play cards that are humans in a way, you can always return them back to your hand, maybe to kind of trigger their abilities a second time if they haven't entered the battlefield kind of ability. And you give him indestructible, so if someone tries to board wipe or, remove him in some sort of way, exile doesn't count as, indestructible doesn't get rid of that, but, it has a decent ability, and this is definitely a solid card that I could, maybe put an extra copy of just so you can kind of consistently draw it when you really want to draw that big endgame creature. Next card up is a Pursued Whale. This card's a 7 mana 8/8, which is an okay card. It's kind of on the expensive side, and the ability really doesn't, equate to being something overall powerful for spending that much mana. When it enters the battlefield, each opponent creates a 1/1 red pirate creature token. This creature can't block, and creatures you control attack each turn if able. So if essentially makes your opponent have to attack into you, which could be used to your benefit. And then spells your opponents to cast a target pursued whale cost to cast. So there's attacks if your opponent tries to directly remove it with a single spell, but it doesn't prevent things like board wipes and things like that. So there is that to think about. Overall, if your opponent's on the aggressive side and you'd rather not have your opponent attack your face, you know, especially at this point in the game, if you kind of, you know, taken a little bit of a beating, you may not want to play this card essentially because it's going to make your opponent attack you regardless. So if your opponent's much wider than you, this is going to be not to your advantage. So it's one of those catch-22s, and I don't really think he's that great personally. But, you know, if you can keep him in the deck, you can keep him in the deck. If you really like the ability and want your opponent to have a pirate creature, that's fine. But like I said, he's not my favorite. I do think there's better cards for, you know, even cheaper mana or the same amount of mana that you could probably get a better ability out overall. Next card up is Beanstalk Giant. This card's actually pretty great for the deck just because it's two things in one. Adventure cards are great. If you've not played adventure cards are essentially cards that have two different abilities. I'm actually blocking all of it, but if you haven't seen this card before, the first ability is for 3 mana. It has Fertile Footsteps, which essentially you get to search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield, and shuffle your library. The reason why this is so great is actually the land comes into the battlefield untapped, so you don't have to play that land tapped, which makes you allows you to play maybe another spell after this. And then the other part of the card is the 7 mana Beanstalk Giant, which essentially its power and toughness is equal to the number of lands you control. So this card takes a benefit of us ramping up with a lot of lands on the battlefield and get very big very quickly. This would be one of those things you want to attach a fully grown to when it comes to targeting something, maybe to give a trample and additional damage. Because, you know, this thing, by the time it comes out, if you played with just lands, it could be a 7 mana 7/7 essentially. Give a trample, it becomes a 10/10 trampler, which makes it definitely very difficult for your opponent to block or try to figure out what they want to do with it. And the last creature spell in the deck is something I'm actually blocking completely yet again, but it's a 7 mana 6/6 trampler. It's okay, but it has a fight ability that when it or another creature enters the battlefield under our control, it actually fights up to one target creature you don't control. So this is actually pretty decent. This is actually maybe worth the 7 mana in a way. I do think I keep one copy in my upgraded version of the deck just because I do like this effect. But whenever a creature enters the battlefield, this fight effect actually triggers. So if you don't have maybe a fight spell, but can play a fight creature, this thing can fight something maybe that's annoying you, or it could be possibly the way that your opponent's getting damage in on you, and essentially this thing can fight it. The one thing is if you play multiple creatures in the same turn, just make sure that if you're fighting a creature, you either keep its toughness where it's at, because it is a 6/6. So, you know, something that's even a 2/3 or 4/3 or whatever it is, just make sure you're kind of keeping it not, you're not playing a creature and then it's going to die, on the second fight spell, unless you don't mind that. That's just something to keep in mind. So there is that. So if you want this thing to attack multiple things, it can on a single turn by playing multiple creatures. If you don't, you can just kind of pace out how many creatures you want, how often you want this thing to attack. And then the mana base is pretty straightforward. It is 25 mana, I believe, or 26 mana. Sorry, 26 mana. I can't count. Math is hard. But 10 islands, 11 forests, 1 temple mastery, and 4 Thornwood Falls. Overall, the mana base is pretty straightforward. If you feel like you're inconsistently not drawing the colors you need, you always play Tectonic Edge. It's a common, non-basic land that essentially searches your library for a basic land, puts it in the battlefield tapped, but you can actually find the color you may need. So if you need more green or you need more blue, you're not drawing your dual lands. That is something as well. If you feel like you need more dual lands, there's always the snow lands, the snow duals that got introduced with call time. So those are additional multicolor lands, and there is a blue-green one there, but it is considered a snow land, but that doesn't really matter for this style deck. But those are just options in case you feel like you need more splashes of both manas, or just feel like a way to search up your mana overall. So, I mean, overall, the deck didn't really change too much. There's a couple of new cards that weren't in the deck originally, but there's just more so essentially just cards that I think we just added more copies of, just kind of make it more beneficial. And we kind of added in like more of like a card draw engine when it comes to like maybe trying to draw some more cards for the deck, and just kind of put more aggressive creatures on the battlefield, maybe for a little bit cheaper mana. So essentially, the one thing that changes is that we got rid of our 1-drops, essentially, but we just added in Edgewell Innkeeper. If you haven't played any of the adventure decks, he's a pretty decent creature. He's 1 mana, 1/1. Then whenever we cast a creature spell that has adventure on it, we can draw a card. If it doesn't need to have gone through the adventure first, so that's pretty good. So if you really just want to play like a Lovestruck Beast or a Brazen Bar out on the battlefield, or even a Beanstalk Giant, you don't have to play the adventure side first in order to get the effect and draw a card out of it. So definitely good there. It's just a good way to kind of create a little bit of card draw engine. because the deck doesn't play too much in the way of card draw, so it's definitely a good way to kind of, draw into your deck to maybe get more threats and get more answers to what your opponent may be doing. Added in 4 copies of Ram Through. I think it was at 3, so we just added the 1 additional. Definitely just a good way to have another, spell that you can do at instant speed. Willful of Haven, we ramped that up to 4 as well. Definitely a good card to maybe try to consistently hit on 2, just to kind of, ramp up on turn 2. Brazen Borrow, we added. It's just a decent card in the sense that, 1, it can bounce target, non-land permanent to its owner's hand at instant speed, which is good, and then we can always play it on the flash fly inside, and it can be a flyer that can catch your opponent off guard. Though it can only block creatures with flying, so that's one downfall. But I do think that both effects is pretty good, and then it works well with Edgewall Innkeeper. 2 copies of Cultivate. I didn't actually go too heavy in the ramp. Essentially, I kind of went with the Willful of Havens, but if you like Cultivate better, you can cut down the Willful of Havens, put more Cultivates in. It depends on how you feel. I just figured, it's a little bit easier maybe play a Willful of Haven out if you're on the play, especially just because it's something that may not get countered as often, whereas the Cultivate may get countered if your opponent doesn't really want you to get 2 lands from your library. So we went with that. 2 copies of Llanowar Visionary. Yet again, I didn't want to go too heavy on... I wanted to keep like a decent balance when it came to actual ramp of things in the deck. I didn't want to play like, 12 or 14 sources of ramp things and not have enough, bulk to the deck, so I decided to keep him at 2. Yet again, if you feel like you need more, maybe cut down on the Brazen Borrowers, add 2 more copies of Llanowar Visionary, or add 2 more copies of Cultivate if you really think that's the way you want to go. Add in Lovestruck Beast. This is definitely a good card that you can work towards if you don't have any copies of him. Essentially, for 1 mana, it creates a 1/1 white human creature token. And then for 3 mana, you get a 5/5 out of it that it can't block unless you control a 1/1 creature. We have the 1/1s that this produces, and we also have the Edgewall Innkeeper. So, essentially we have 8 sources of, producing 1/1s. But overall, even if you don't have a 1/1 on the battlefield, a 5/5 is definitely something your opponent has to kind of get rid of, or they have to attack into it unless they attack in the air. So definitely a decent blocker as well. Then we ramped up to 2 copies of Elder Gargaroth. I didn't want to go too heavy on Elder Gargaroth just because, yet again, it is decent, but I didn't want to go too expensive in the way of how much you craft it. But if you do have extra things and you want to cut back on things, Elder Gargaroth is always a decent card that you can always focus on. So there is that. 2 copies of Sublime Epiphany, just because I do think it's a decent counter spell with all these effects. 2 copies of Kogla, just to kind of, maybe consistently draw it when we get into a later game. It's just always good to have an extra copy, just in case something happens to the first copy. 4 copies of Beanstalk Giant. Like I said, this is like our other ramp card. That's why it's maybe, as well, you don't have to play, 4 copies of Beanstalk Giant. You can play 2 more copies of Cultivate. But I do think the Fertile Footsteps part of it a little bit better, in my opinion, than Cultivate, so it's up to you. Really want to go that way. We got 1 copy of Thornmouth just because, it's a good card to have, but, it's a little bit on the expensive side, so it's up to you if you really want to play more copies, but I just kept the 1. And then the last card is because we play a lot of big things. I did decide to add in a copy of the Great Henge. It's a 9 mana artifact that costs X less to cast, where X is the greatest power of among creatures you control. So essentially on turn 4, we can play for 3 mana. And then whenever we cast, or whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield, it's going to get a +1/+1 counter, and then we have to draw a card. So essentially, this is our way we kind of draw more cards in our deck and make our threats stat a little bit more aggressive in that way, and we get some life gain out of it, which is always pretty good, and it produces 2 mana, which is also very good. And then the mana base is pretty straightforward. It's 8 islands, 1 Castle Garenbrig. You can add more copies of this, but it only the second ability here is 4 mana, 2 colorless and 2 green, and you add 6 mana to spend this mana only to cast creature spells or activate abilities of creatures you control. So it is a decent land, but it's not super effective in the way that there's a lot of things in our deck that may not be able to be cast with it, but it's good to have 1 copy of, so you can maybe pay 4 mana and get an Elder Gargaroth, or get a Kogla the Great Ape, or whatever it is. So that is a possibility there. 8 forests. We got 4 of the blue-green pathways to kind of round it out. 1 Temple of Mastery, just because the scry is always okay, maybe in the early game if you're still trying to get the right cards, and the scry can always help you there. And then I added in the 4 copies of Fabled Passage, which is a slightly better Evolving Wilds, just because after you have 4 lands on the battlefield, essentially you're whenever you search your library for a basic land card, it comes to the battlefield untapped. So that's definitely a little bit better than Evolving Wilds. But overall, the deck is pretty straightforward. I do like this version. I mean, if you guys have any suggestions on maybe how you tweak this version of the deck, let me know in the comments below. It's always cool to hear what you guys say. But let's move on to the next deck. So this next deck, I think, was actually asked if I could do a version of it in the first video, but I kind of wanted to hold this one because I do think this is probably the most aggressive out of all of the starter decks, just in the way of the colors and, you know, the cards that are in the deck. And this is Boros Knights, or Company of Knights, I guess is what they call it. The deck is interesting, like I said, with the card basis. It is a good way to get an Embercleave. You know, you don't have one, you may not unlocked it yet. Embercleave is a very strong card in aggressive decks just because it gives target creature +1 double trample. This card is definitely a good, not, I wouldn't say a must, but it's a good card for most aggro decks that play red, just because it's easily castable if you have double red, because it costs less, like I said, for each attacking creature. Or maybe I didn't say it, I don't really know. But, you know, that's definitely a good card, and you can play it at flash speed, so you can attack in, see what your opponent does, then play it in flash speed and kind of go from there. But with that being said, let's go over the cards and kind of talk about each one. You got Venerable Knight, which is a good card here. When it dies, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on target knight you control. The focus of the deck is knights, so there's definitely going to be, most of the time, there's going to be a target for this +1/+1 counter. Like I said, red has actually some of the better pump spells. So Infuriate is one of them. It's a 1 mana, give target creature +3/+2. Sure, it doesn't give trample compared to like some of the green stuff. But, I mean, for 1 mana, you're getting, I think, an overall better ability just because it's cheaper. So you can definitely fit it. You can play something bigger and aggressive and then fit this card in. So definitely good there. Weaselback Redcap. It's a 1 mana 1/1. Tap 2 mana, give a +2/+0 at the end of turn. So if your opponent's not blocking, you can get that little bit of extra damage in to kind of, you know, get their life points down pretty quickly. Short Sword is a very basic equipment. Just equip target creature, gets +1/+1 for 1 mana. Pacifism, I think, is up there with, you know, some of the decently, you know, affordable or budget style, you know, I wouldn't say removal, but like spells that can slow down your opponent's aggressive board. You know, enchanted creature can't attack or block, so that's very good. So it slows down your opponent's creatures. You can always, you know, replace this with like a glass casket if your opponent plays a lot of creatures, or maybe you're playing against a lot of decks that play a lot of creatures. For 2 mana, it's definitely an equal card there. You can also even pay 1 additional and pay Banish and Light if you want to exile things from the battlefield. So it's up to you really how you want to go about it. But, you know, that's definitely a decent card to keep in the deck if you kind of want to, like this, you know, enchanted creature can't attack or block. You got Worthy Knight. Whenever we cast a Night spell, it could create a 1/1 human creature token. So definitely a good way to get wide on your opponent. I do, you know, ramp up. I would say you want to ramp up copies of this because, you know, putting additional threats on the battlefield to get wide. Sure, they're only 1/1s, but, you know, over time you'll hit him for 1 damage with these tokens. You either create great chump blockers, or, you know, start pecking down your opponent's life totals until you get to a point where you can maybe swing all in and your opponent really can't do anything about it. Youthful Knight, it's a very solid 2 mana. It's a 2 mana 2/1 for a striker, so solid there. It's kind of vanilla, you know, it doesn't really have anything else, but first strike's pretty decent just because, you know, first strike, the creature deals damage before your opponent's creature does damage in a separate phase. So it definitely, you know, peck off, you know, maybe some other creatures your opponent's playing. But, you know, there's definitely some better 2-drops I do think you can fit in the deck. But it's a decent Knight that you can keep in the deck for a while as you're slowly upgrading the deck. Then we follow that up with the Rimrock Knight. It's another card from Corona Veldraine. Essentially, this is the other red pump spell that it has, because this Boulder Rush ability is on the one-side adventure. Target creature gets +2/+0 at the end of turn. And then for 2 mana, you can pay the 3/1, but it can't block. But, I mean, a 3/1 body is a pretty decent thing as well. You know, play this on turn 2, even if, you know, you don't play the first side. Is a very aggressive play if you really want to be very aggressive against your opponent if they're playing a much slower deck. So definitely a solid card there if you want to be the aggressor when it comes to the matchup. Then you got Scorching Dragonfire. This is a pretty decent removal spell. It does need a creature or planeswalker to target in order to actually play it. But it deals 3 damage to target creature or planeswalker. If that creature or planeswalker would die, it exiles instead. This is actually very good if your opponent plays something that may trigger on, like, if your opponent plays a creature that may trigger an ability on death, or when it goes to the graveyard. This actually exiles, so it goes to the exile zone instead, so that death ability doesn't trigger, so that's definitely good there. But overall, pretty decent removal spell. There is a couple other 2 mana removal spells, depending on how you want to go there. I think Fire Prophecy is one of them, where, you know, does 3 damage, and you have to take a card from your hand and put it on the bottom of your library, and then draw a new card. It's up to you, really, on how you want to play removal, but I would say this is definitely a good option if this is the way you want to go. You got Inspiring Veteran, which is essentially the Night Lord. It gives other knights you control +1/+1. It is a 2/2 himself for 2 mana, so definitely very affordable in that sense. You know, this is something you probably want to add more, you know, maybe up to 4 copies of in your deck, just because you probably want to draw this consistently, so you can pump up your knights and be a little bit more on the aggressive side. Though it doesn't work with our human tokens that we're creating with the Worthy Knight. Still, our knights being more aggressive is always to our benefit. You have the Acclaimed Contender, another interesting card here. It's not a card that you want to play 4 copies of, even though it's a rare. But it is decent in the sense that if you control another knight, you get to look at the top 5 cards of your library. You can search, you can reveal a knight or equipment or legendary artifact among them and put it into your hand and put the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. So we don't play too many cards in the way of card draw, so this is definitely a good way to draw some cards. But you know, it's something that that's what all it is. It doesn't, you know, it's a 3/3 for 3 mana, so it's nothing great outside of that. But it's definitely a card that you may want to play 2 copies of just so you get this effect occasionally, depending on how the game goes. Then you got Dub, which is a 3 mana aura, enchanted creature. Enchanted creatures +2/+2, has first strike, and is a knight in addition to its other types. It's an okay card, but you know, I do think at 3 mana you can actually add in maybe an equipment that could be better. You know, this is definitely a replacement. You know, you can add in more copies of Embercleave. But I sometimes I like auras, but this is not one of them. I just don't think the aura is that great for 3 mana. But sure, it's a common, so I guess I understand its power overall. You got Ardenvale Tactician. I do like this card. Not really for its creature side, but I do like the ability to tap up to 2 creatures your opponent's control. So this can either set up, you know, maybe an aggressive attack on the following turn if your opponent only has very few creatures to block with. Or, you know, you can slow down your opponent if they're being also aggressive. You want to slow some damage coming in by tapping maybe something big that would probably be attacking you that you otherwise would have to chump and or just take the damage of. So that's definitely a good ability. And like I said, the other side's a plus because things in flying are sometimes harder to block if your opponent doesn't play any way to prevent that kind of damage. Now we're going into like kind of like the meat and potatoes of the deck, kind of the 4/5+ range, where we're playing some of the bigger threats overall in the starter deck. The first one here is the Basari's Lieutenant. It's a 4 mana 3/4. It has vigilance, protection from multicolor. Definitely decent in the rogue matchup, in the sense that, you know, they can't play their rogue spell on it to kind of destroy it in that sense. Or if your opponent plays any other like multicolor removal, this is pretty good in that regard. But it's interesting in the fact that when it enters the battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature control, so you can either target itself or another creature control. And then whenever itself or another you control dies, if it has a +1/+1 counter on it, you get to create a 2/2 white knight token with vigilance. So definitely a good way to replace itself, especially if your opponent does like a board wipe that would just destroy your creatures instead of exiling them. So definitely a good way to kind of replenish the board if your things are going to die. And it has vigilance, so and they both have vigilance, so it's very good, and it produces a knight token, so that's also good. So definitely a good card. I do think that's something you probably want more copies or work more copies of, just because I do think it's a pretty solid 4-drop for the deck that kind of fits in with the whole style of the deck overall. Then you get the Basari's Alkali. It's a 4 mana 2/3 lifelinker. Enters battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter on it for up to 2 target creatures you control. That is kind of a mouthful to say, just the way they worded it. But this is a good way to get some +1/+1 counters on creatures you control outside of Basari's Lieutenant. But I don't think it's the best spell overall. It is a 4 mana spell that's only a 2/3 lifelinker, and then it gets +1/+1 counters onto things. But it's tough to say, like, is it super effective? I do think there's better things you could probably play. Like I said, you could add more copies of the Lieutenant. You know, it's definitely something I would cut for that. So it's okay in the beginning as you're starting to get some +1/+1 counters, but I do think this is easily replaceable as you want to focus on more of the Knight Tribal. It's also Cat Cleric, I kind of forgot to mention, so it doesn't really fit in the Knight idea, but it does fit in with the idea of us putting +1/+1 counters on things we control. Then you got the Fireborn Knight. It's a 4 mana 2/3 double striker, so double strike is like first strike, but it actually hits for damage twice if you don't know what double strike does. So it does first strike damage and then does regular damage. It's an okay card, but it's a little bit on the pricey side for that effect. It is only a 2/3 for 4 mana, so it's not the strongest thing. Sure, it has double strike, so it could possibly do 4 damage to your opponent. But you know, the effect here for the additional, you can pay for 4 additional mana until end of turn. You give it +1/+1, so maybe it gets that additional 2 damage in for every 4 mana you pay. But you know, it's definitely a tough sell for me, just because, you know, this deck is a little bit wants to be on the more aggressive side, so it's not going to always have a lot of mana, and 4 mana is a lot to pay for additional damage. If you can, you know, line it up with an Infuriate or something like that, sure, it could be definitely aggressive, but I just think there's better things. Yet again, this is something also you could cut, maybe to add in more lieutenants. I just don't really like, it's just not, to me, worth the investment that you would have to pay to really get the effect of it. You got Haktos, which I always found to be kind of weird with this starter deck, just because it's a 4 mana 6/1. And it's a human warrior, so that's actually why I found it weird. I get it that it's a Boros like card, so that's probably why it's in the deck. And it's a decent card overall because the one downfall is it does have to attack each turn if able, so it always has to swing. And it enters the battlefield, you get to choose 2, 3, or 4 at random. I don't know why it says choose 2, 3, or 4 at random. You know, it should just say like it chooses 2, 3, or 4 at random. Haktos gains protection from converted mana cost other than the chosen number. So if it gets like 4, 2, or 3, everything else it can't target it. I would say 4 is probably the best number here, just because there's not too much other than Binding. Maybe there's not. I can't really think off the top of my head too many cards that are really 4 mana that it removes target spell directly. So it definitely has protection from a lot of things. Maybe has a lot of creatures that can block it at 4 mana. So it's one of those things that maybe like 4 or 3 are probably best. 2 is probably not the greatest because there's a lot of removal in 2 that you can definitely play. So it's definitely an interesting card in that sense. And like I said, it's probably something you will eventually remove just because it's not a knight, so it's not going to get any additional benefits of things that knights would control. And the other thing too is because that's protection from other things, we actually can't equip Embercleave to it to be more aggressive with it. So that's the one other downfall because that's protection from other things. So it's not really going to be able to get that additional damage in. Which is unfortunate just because this is, even if we pay only 3 mana or 4 mana, it's still converted mana costs 6, so it can't target that. So just figured I'd give that heads up. Then you get the Burning Yard Trainer. It's a 5 mana 3/3 trample haster. Enters the battlefield to other knight you control gets +2/+2 against trample and haste until end of turn. Yet again, it's an okay card. It's decent in the beginning just because, you know, we have a bunch of things, you know, making a knight +2/+2 and give it trample and haste is decent. The thing is, the haste probably won't really matter too much because you're probably playing it on turn like 5, turn 6. We don't probably have a bunch of mana out to play maybe something to follow it up. So it overall, it's going to be a 5/5 pump target creature, give it trample as well. Maybe if we have the extra mana, we can play something after, you know, before it so we can actually gain the effect. But most of the times, we're just going to play it as a way to just kind of make us a little bit more on the aggressive side, you know, give things trample kind of thing. 5 mana is kind of on the steep side. If it was maybe 4 mana, I'd like it a little bit more. You know, you could probably get rid of either trample or haste. To me, it really doesn't matter too much. Like I said, I just think it's a little bit on the pricier side for what it really is trying to do. Then you get Grasping Giant, which is an interesting card here. It's a giant because it's in its name. It's not a knight at all. It's a 5/7 vigilance, which is definitely very decent. Just like the Haktos, I do think this is probably one of those cards you can kind of slowly, you know, eliminate as you get towards the end if you want to slowly upgrade into the upgraded version of this deck. And whenever it becomes blocked by a creature, exile that creature until it leaves the battlefield, which is also very interesting because it's a 5/7. Your opponent's going to want to probably put something in front of it. But the idea that it actually exiles that creature until it leaves is definitely interesting in that sense. So it's definitely going to probably have a couple cards underneath it if your opponent can't really remove it. And they're going to have to eventually throw stuff in front of it in order to block it. So I don't know if it removes, I don't know if it's all the creatures or if it's a creature. So that's something I actually haven't played a lot with in this deck, just because it's hard to draw, just because it's a one of. So I haven't personally drawn many of it. I haven't drawn copies of it when I actually play tested just this version of the deck, just to kind of get a feel for it. But like I said, it is an interesting card. It is probably something you can get rid of towards the end as you kind of fine tune the deck and kind of get, you know, certain cards where you want them. So definitely something that you can keep in the deck for a while. We already kind of went over Embercleave, but yet again, just a very good card. It's kind of the reason why a lot of your decks that play red play this card, is just because it's a good way to finish off the game. You know, just on the basis of target creature, it's +1/+1, double strike, and trample. You put that on a 3/3, 4/4. It's now a 5/5. It can swing in essentially for 10 damage that your opponent has to put something in front of, or their life points are gonna dwindle pretty quickly. Overall, a solid card in just that sense. And then the mana base is on the more, you know, it's at, I think 24 lands, just because, like I said, it's a little bit more of the aggressive deck. When you play more aggressive, you don't need to play as many lands. Though I do think in Arena, I somehow think that 24 to 26 is kind of like the perfect amount, just because of the way the shuffler likes to work sometimes. So it's 9 plains, 10 mountains, 1 Temple of Triumph, and 1 Windscar Crag. The one thing I would say, I don't know if I recommended this in other videos, if you always have trouble drawing particular colors that you need for the deck, just because there are some more expensive, like, you know, double whites or double reds, you know, costs in certain spells. You know, Evolve and Wilds is always a budget option to add in to kind of filter mana as you need it. Eventually, you can always upgrade those into Fabled Passages if you really want to. So it's really up to you where you want to go when it comes to the mana base. I usually guarantee, you know, one of the things is I always like to replace the tap lanes with untapped lanes, like the pathways. So that is one thing. But let's dive into the upgraded version. We kind of talk about that one and kind of see the differences. So essentially, nothing much really changed with the deck overall. It's just, I would say we just kind of fine-tuned some of the cards and kind of got rid of some of the bloat. overall. But I think it's an actual pretty decent deck the way I have it set up. We do get a little bit more on the aggressive side. We do add in some, lower cost in things, and we add in more copies of things that are lower cost in. But essentially, overall, it's pretty much the same deck. It would just, like I said, those couple added cards. So we add in we keep in the 3 copies of Venerable Knight, which is pretty solid there in the 1-drop side. Then we add in Fervent Champion, which is definitely a very solid card. If you've ever played Mono Red, you know this card back and front. It's essentially, especially on the play, it's definitely a good way to be aggressive. And because we have Knights, this second ability, whenever it attacks another Knight you control, gets +1/+0 on the turn. So either you have another Fervent Champion out that you're gonna have +1/+0, or one of our many other Knights in the deck are gonna get +1/+0 if it attacks in as well with the Fervent Champion. The other cool thing here is that equipments cost 3 less to activate, so we actually add in Ball, the Skyclave, and Embercleave as well as a 3 cost equip ability in case it falls off a creature. You can always equip it essentially to a Fervent Champion for free, which is always very good. We kept in the 2 copies of Infuriate because this helps us get in that early pressure early in the game. If you get your opponent down to like 10 life by like turn 3 or turn 4, it definitely puts a lot of pressure on your opponent to have to be on the more defensive side because their life points are kind of dwindling away. Kept in the 2 copies of Pacifism just because, like I said, it's a good card. There's other cards you can always swap out in case you don't like Pacifism, but we kept it in here just because like I said, it's a pretty solid card and slows down blockers and things like that make it in the way. Worthy Knight, we ramped it up to 4 copies because we do have a decent amount of Knights in the deck. We're definitely going to probably trigger this a few times, get those 1/1 creatures out, maybe get a little bit wider on our opponent. Rimrock Knight, we went up to 4 copies just because the Boulder Rush ability and also 3/1's pretty decent and aggressive. Works very well with the Fervent Champion, so you get a Fervent Champion and a Rimrock Knight and they swing in together. This becomes 4/1, which definitely puts a lot of pressure on your opponent that way too. Scorching Dragonfire, we kept in for some of that spot removal because of the exile effect. And it's overall pretty decent of a card. 4 copies of Inspire and Veteran. Like I said, you want to draw this more consistently. This is essentially our Knight Lord. It's going to pump up all our other Knights, so making sure we kind of hopefully draw at least 1 copy of it in a game is going to be very good, and 4 copies is going to give us the best chance of doing so. We kind of kept the Claim Contender up to 2 copies. Like I said, it's a good card to draw into, but it's not a card we need to really hit to win the game. But it helps us dig a little bit because we lack card draw, so that's the one payoff for the card. We added in 2 copies of Maul the Skyclave because you can have in that equipment that 1, it will give a creature +2/+2. Gives that creature fly, and so makes that creature even more pesky and annoying for your opponent to deal with. And it also gives that creature first strike. To equip this to a Fervent Champion, if it falls off a creature, you have to pay 2 white mana. It doesn't actually reduce the cost of the white whole mana. But, it's always a good card to have, just kind of, I guess, go alongside of Embercleave in case you don't draw into this. We went up to 4 copies of Basri's Lieutenant. Just like I said, it gives +1/+1 counter to any of our creatures, even itself. And if a creature with a +1/+1 counter does die, it creates a 2/2 white creature to replace it. So it's definitely a good way to have backup creatures. Protection from multicolor is also very good in that sense as well. And then we went with 3 copies of Embercleave. Just because we want to draw into it. I could have went 4 copies, but I decided to add in 1 copy of Circle of Loyalty. If you don't really want to play Circle of Loyalty, you can just always add in a 4th copy of Embercleave, I would say. And it costs 1 less for each Knight we control, so this thing can get kind of fairly cheap. It's kind of essentially the white version of the Great Henge, but for Knights. And it gives creatures we control +1/+1, so on top of our Inspire Veteran, just another card that's going to give creatures +1/+1. If we cast a legendary spell, create a 2/2 white Knight creature, token with Vigilance. We don't actually have a lot of legendary spells except for the Embercleave. But, I do think the ability to actually have a way to give just our overall board +1/+1. And in the later game, if we're kind of drawing dead on Knights, we can always tap 4 mana, tap it, and we created 2/2 white Knight creature token with Vigilance, which essentially, when it comes out, and this is on the battlefield, is a 3/3. So definitely good in that sense. So definitely overall fairly a little bit on the more cheaper side when it comes to casting spells. We don't really have, we kind of end at 4, and these cards cost less for each of these other cards we have that are cheaper on the battlefield out. So definitely very good that way. Land base is pretty straightforward. I think we're only running 23 lands, I think I went with. Just because, like I said, 4 is okay to get to, 5, 6 is okay. We don't really need to draw a bunch of land, but we just need to maybe get to at least 4 or 5 mana out on the battlefield to be pretty effective. So 9 plains, 9 mountains, 1 castle Embereth because it's going to make our wider board because we're going to play a lot of smaller things, a little bit more on the aggressive side because in the later game we could always pay 3 mana and give all our creatures +1/+0 on the turn, so that's definitely very good there. And then we added in the white and red pathway as another card to kind of help us out as well to kind of, You don't want to, in an aggressive aggro deck, you don't want to have lands that come into play battlefield tapped, so this definitely helps us with that as well. Yeah, I don't really need those cards in the sideboard, not really sure why they're there. But like I said, this is yet again another list with my upgrades and whatnot. You know, you guys can leave comments down below, depending on, you know, what changes you guys want to make to the decks overall. But, you know, this is all the starter decks, so let me know in the comments below if there's any other decks you want me to go over. I know there's the monocolor starter decks that I know have been around, so if you want me to go over those, let me know there. But guys, if you liked the video, hit that like button. It definitely helps out a lot. If you're new here, want to post videos on the channel, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next video.